Dear ladies and gentlemen, if you take your seats, please. Dear Sabine Frerichs, co-directors, eminences, etc. The topic of today, not to be mixed up with the recipe for today, is behavioral and neuroeconomics in socio-legal perspective. Professor Dr. Sabine Frerichs is currently fellow at the Käte Hamburger Center Lawyers Culture and professor of economic sociology at the Vienna University of Economics and Business. In her lecture, Sabine Frerichs will give insight into the research field of behavioral and neuroeconomics, which, despite having attracted much academic, political and public attention in recent years, has not yet been a focus of research at the Käte Hamburger Center yet, at least not so much. It is perhaps sometimes in the background, but we have not focused on that specific dimension of research on the law. She has promised to introduce different strands of behavioral and neuroeconomics, including their respective social ontologies. Did any kind of questions arise from the perspective of the law as culture paradigm in order to study those questions? In an unexpressed assumption of the paradigm, we assume that moral, ethical and juridical questions of the quid juris type cannot be reduced to scientific problems in the sense of the natural sciences. The old question of freedom of will as a precondition for criminal attribution cannot be undermined by proving the determinacy of action by causal factors, we would say. The judgment of accountability in the sense of responsibility of the will, we do not want to completely hand over into the hands of the psychiatrist and the seat of law in life. We generally do not want to see replaced by a localization in the brain, wherever the sense of justice and the feelings of juristic right and wrong questions might really exist. However, the question remains, is there anything to be learned by cognitive and emotive neurosciences about the human condition that shapes our image of man and his capability to be steered by codes, normative orders and sanctions? Is there any kind of bridging between the two scientific cultures that heavily reclaim their respective autonomy, looked at as an unfriendly takeover by the other scientific culture? Neurosciences have made enormous progress through the last decennies, certainly more than the moralities in the same research period, unfortunately, we have to confess. But what are the insights? How do they change our perspectives? What kind of further knowledge would we need? In her announcement of the evening, Sabine Frerichs proclaims behavioral and neuroeconomics aim to make economics more realistic, further the unification of the social, behavioral and natural sciences, and provide new levers for welfare increasing policies. Instead of starting from a narrow understanding of Homo economicus as a fully informed, self-interested and entirely consistently utility maximizer, Sabine Frerichs' research strives to provide a psychologically and physiologically more accurate account of economic decision-making. So this will be, I think, a very strong argument of your presentation. You will touch the mainstream of behavioral and neuroeconomics that is marked by a naturalist and individualist research orientation in the same time, whether it is concerned with cognitive biases and in individual decision-making or social preferences in situations of strategic interaction or reworking neoclassical models to better reflect brain processes. Based on those findings, Sabine Frerichs intends to explore. I speak about you as if you were not present. Excuse me, I should say it's you. Yes, it's Sabine Frerichs. You intend to explore the potential of a sociological critique. Sociological critique that we know from the classical arguments against, let me say, the basic rational choice type of argumentation on the one hand, in several dimensions, as a sociology of economics, as a sociology of science, by making the epistemological consequences more clear, and a sociology of law. I'm very curious to see how we could safeguard some of the insights into brain structures and functions in order to get a more complete understanding of human behavior, including behavior that is oriented towards a normative order. So I have a very good introduction into neurosciences. It is for children. Explore ton cerveau. It has been written by a friend of mine, Olivier Houdet, who is works at the Sorbonne, and he explained me he's working in this field for more than 30 years, and he tells me if I'm not able to bring it into that format, it doesn't make sense to me. And all questions of location of the brain and everything, I will give it around, is really so you will have in 5 minutes all the insights necessary. I'll give it after your talk. No choice, at least, I see, to avoid the rational choice paradigm in that, and its sociological critique. You will come to that if I understood rightly. However, in this very well-discussed field, too, my interest is to see where convergences between a sociologically loaded understanding of RC theorizing, completed by the symbolic and some structural factors, might interfere with those attempts in the sociological critique of utilitarian theorizing that give a right to a methodological rationalism. Insofar, I see some dialectical advantages before us. I hope we are well prepared for this dangerous voyage. Who is the adventurous lady to seduce us to such a kind of traveling? Professor Dr. Sabine Frerichs studied sociology, economics, and political science at the University of Trier. In 2005, she earned her doctorate at an interdisciplinary graduate research center at the University of Bamberg with a thesis on judicial governance in the European Community of Law, integration through law beyond the state. In 2013, she also received her postdoctoral degree in sociology at the University of Bamberg. Both her doctoral and habilitation theses were honored with dissertation and habilitation prizes from the University of Bamberg, respectively. That is the moment when you are presented that you understand that those prizes really made a sense some time ago. So it's long ago for you. And if I see right, we share by this experience to have worked with the most restless and prolific author German sociology has produced at all, namely Richard Mönch, who was also my teacher. Furthermore, Sabine Frerichs received the dissertation award from the German Sociological Association. Following her habilitation, she was assistant professor at the University of Helsinki's Faculty of Law, where she also previously worked as a postdoctoral researcher at the Center of Excellence Foundations of European Law and Polity. In addition, she was a postdoctoral fellow at the European University Institute in Florence in 2012, as well as visiting lecturer at Karlsruhe University in Prague in 2015. Since 2016, she has been professor of economic sociology at Vienna University of Economics and Business, some kind of tradition in Vienna. And since October, you are at the Käte Hamburger Center Law as Culture. We were proud to persuade your colleagues at Vienna to let you go for a whole year, but you will prove certainly your gratitude by way of your productive work at the center. Let me name only some of your very well-renowned publications. What is the Social and Behavioral Economics, to come out very soon. Another one, Correlated Ownership with Rick James, Polanyi, Commons and the Property Continuum. That might be also interesting for Katharina. She's over there. Unraveling the European community of debt as a characterization of Europe. You understand the tonality of this characterization, and it continues like that. I'll stop here in order to say that the floor now is yours, and don't forget, you have 45 minutes at maximum. Good luck, and don't exceed it too much.
Yes.
It's your turn.
Okay. So thanks a lot, Professor Gappert, for this kind introduction and for the invitation to be here in the first place, which well, saved my life in a way. So you heard a lot of introduction now. So my topic, behavioural and neuroeconomics and socio-legal perspective, will be approached from a sociological point of view, which I try to twist into socio-legal, but I don't completely know yet what that is. What I'm going to do is to briefly talk you through the structure. So I will first just introduce into what is behavioural and neuroeconomics. I will try to figure out what approach I'm taking, and then I will go into the depth of this question of what's the social ontology, what is the understanding of the social in behavioral and neuroeconomics, which is what I'm kind of struggling with, what I want to find out, where I have suspicions, where there's a lot of sociological bashing going on, because this has to do with this unfriendly takeover of my discipline by others. So what is really behind that, and then the question which has this socio-legal relevance, what are the normative implications, the implications for regulation, politics, law. I have been working a little bit in that context with regard to consumer law, but there are other fields, and I will briefly, if I have the chance, talk about them as well. Then I'll give an example of where practical work, experimental work in behavioral and neuroeconomics also has implications for our understanding of market economy, also serves maybe as a justification of certain institutions foundational for the market economy. And this aspect is interesting just to see, because we have to explore, we have to understand how much of that is science and how much of that is interpretation. Okay. And I will conclude with giving you a view on my broader aims of the project, which will go beyond my time here as well. Okay, so as you saw from the abstract, I make some ambitious claims about the field of behavioral and neuroeconomics, which is vast, which is immensely growing, has been growing immensely over the last few decades. But I claim very broadly and grossly that they manifest a truncated, a limited understanding of the social, which does not sufficiently account for social contingency, for the variability of social life, and for the variability of human behavior in different social conditions. So the accusation is clear. They are offering too limited, too naturalist a point of view on human behavior. So that's gross, of course. So this is problematic from the perspective of science proper, because behavioral regularities, which you may observe in certain experiments, are presented as laws which are linked with our human condition, which suggests they are unchangeable and so on. So this generalizability is questionable if behavioral neuroeconomics neglects social contingency. And it's also problematic from a political point of view with regard to the normative, the policy implications of behavioral and neuroeconomics, because what do you derive from these findings? So if you derive that some, now already anticipating a little bit, some cognitive failures of human beings are just come with human nature, then you respond to them in a different way than if they were just the product of certain circumstances, so roughly speaking. Okay, so this is the kind of soundtrack behind, or also the motivation which is behind this piece of research. So now I guess not all of you are economists, and not all of you are aficionados of these new directions, these new heterodox directions in the economic discipline. So I try to briefly just give some introductions into what's relevant for now. So the economic discipline, other than, for example, my home discipline, sociology, is not as pluralist in orientation, not as pluralist in that there are different sets of theories, different paradigms, more or less peacefully, sometimes less coexisting next to each other, but economics is strongly dominated by what is called the neoclassical paradigm, neoclassical standard economics. And you will have come across the notion of homo economicus, which is also used in other social scientific disciplines, but which has like the homestead in neoclassical economics. So homo economicus, rational choice, are axiomatic foundations of neoclassical economics, meaning that they are kind of products of thought, or starting points in thinking, and the claim is not in the first place that this is the truth about how we behave each and every moment. This model, so I emphasize really this model of action, sees or assumes that we act as perfectly informed, fully consistent, self-interested utility maximizers. So that by and large our behavior can be well explained using this very highly simplified and schematic model of action. So this is the rational choice approach at its best. So now behavioral economics questions the fertility of this rational choice paradigm, and the productivity and the validity also in empirical research settings. Therefore, behavioral economics strives to change this model, improve this model by making it, psychologically speaking, more accurate. So, and this requires not like axiomatic assumptions, but empirically validated assumptions about human action, which can still be simplifications of how we act each and every moment, but in some respects the rational model of man fails with regard to explaining how people really act and predicting that and so on, especially like also both on the individual level at some times, but also on the aggregate level. And in these occasions, behavioral economics says we have to change that model. It doesn't make sense to stick to that. So, and what's famous now for behavioral economics is that these strong assumptions about perfect information, full consistency, and self-interest, which are made in like the fully specified homo economicus model, are qualified by way of introducing bounded rationality, bounded willpower, bounded self-interest. So they are taken back to some extent. They are watered down, one could say, or they are enriched. Depends on how one sees that. So in a way, behavioral economists would say that the completely rational economic man is maybe only an exception, but the more general model would include these limits of rationality, which I just referred to. So, and including these more empirically sound assumptions would make the model more realistic and come closer to how people really make decisions. Okay. Now, neither neoclassical economists nor behavioral economists are as such stupid. So this is important to acknowledge for every critical attacker. So it makes sense for neoclassical economists to start from the model as it is. And I'll just give an example. So one assumption in neoclassical economics is that preferences, our tastes, what we like, are stable, and they are given. They are kind of just there. So, and if you once learned my preferences, then they would assume that I do not change them the next day. So, but this doesn't mean that people cannot change their preferences. They can learn and so on. But this is again like a simplification of a model which wants to understand my change in behavior depending on the circumstances. So in economics, these are like price changes, or if my income rises, or if the law changes. And if I allow for preferences also to change all of the time, then I cannot attribute behavioral changes anymore to these change in circumstances, which is kind of the explanatory factor which I'm looking for in economics. So it has reasons why these assumptions are stark as that. Now I put here like apples and oranges, or like one apple and orange. So this is just to indicate one central means of economic theorizing is, or one starting point of neoclassical economic theorizing is that we have like consistent transitive preference orders. So if I prefer an apple to an orange, then I should do that in all kinds of choice constellations where this ranking is in question, and not when I'm suddenly offered, when I introduce yet another offer so that I suddenly prefer oranges to apples or so. Then I would be inconsistent, and this is again something which the theory cannot allow for. Now, these inconsistencies are exactly now something which behavioral economics kind of jumps at and tries to explain in regular ways. So behavioral economics specifies conditions under which we are inconsistent, and suggests that this is pretty normal, that we are all inconsistent in certain circumstances. For example, when the menu, the range of options from which I can choose is manipulated. So then another inconsistency of our behavior has to do with apples and chocolate cake. So at some point, if I'm on a diet, if I want to lose weight or so, I might say I prefer an apple to a piece of chocolate cake. And then again, then you find me in the afternoon and I eat the chocolate cake. So then my preference kind of has been inconsistent, or my choice has been inconsistent. And again, behavioral economics says that's all too humane. This is a behavioral regularity, this inconsistency over time, this bounded willpower, which makes us change our choices just like that. And then self-interest, so this opening up of the self-interest assumption to also include like the utility which others get. This is something which is also important in this approach. So, and it can be illustrated simply by this, that like if I share my chocolate cake with someone else, I might even enjoy it more, even though I get only half, than eating it all alone. And this would indicate then like social preferences. Yeah, and it's in the very simple neoclassical standard model, you would always say more is more. So the more I get, the better, and not sharing with others. Okay, so this is just to get you into this technique a little bit, and why that is at stake now in behavioral economics. Another illustration works with Homer Simpson, which maybe also most of you know, or maybe that's, don't know if that's old-fashioned already, so I'm not so up-to-date in that regard. But there's a famous book by Richard Thaler and Kasanstein called Nudge, and people expected me to talk about that definitely today. And in that book, which is a popular book, which is a bestseller there, Homer Simpson is also used as illustration for like the naive consumer, for the one who indeed suffers from bounded rationality, bounded willpower, and so on. Now, do you get this argument here? So nudging means like pushing someone a little bit to his or her own best interest, like manipulating a little bit, but not in a way that I command somebody to do something, but rather I suggest, and then they might respond to that unconsciously. So here, this is again like this kind of case, shall I have a fruit or a piece of something else, chocolate cake, here a donut, and the trick is, of course, that if you place the healthy, fresh fruit right in front of this lazy Homer Simpson, then he will grab that rather than go all the way to the fridge where the donuts are kept. So this is nudging, like like what the shopkeeper he is doing. So it was his initiative, his choice architecture, as one term, technical term is for this, was to rearrange it so that the lazy customer would be mocked, kind of, to get better a better diet. Okay. So neuroeconomics is not just an extension of behavioral economics, but a large part of it is. So it uses neuroscientific methods to study how the brain works in economic decision making, and this may then include like completely rational economic decisions as well as these bounded, the irrational ones. And in a way, it's quite simple that the same experiments, the same studies which are done to substantiate cognitive failures, like behavioral inconsistencies, they are then also undertaken in brain scans or using other measurements, physiological or measurements, to track down these inconsistencies and what's really going on in our heads. Yeah. Okay. So I decided not to show any brain pictures, so I don't know if the book has some, but yes, okay.
Yes, some images are circulating.
Yes, so this is like a complementary to this. Now, what's my approach? And I said that actually, yeah, it's not that I start from a very fixed approach, but I try to explain my starting point. So I'm a sociologist, I can't help. And so what I did for a couple of years, because during my doctoral studies, I came across the law and then couldn't ignore it anymore. So I started to do a kind of sociology of law, but even then the problem was, what is sociology of law? Because some lawyers think all empirical studies on the law are sociology of law, and well, coming from sociology, I think about applying sociological theories to law, and so there are some differences. I came to call what I was doing economic sociology of law, because I'm always interested in the intersection, which is right here at the center now, law and economy. So one thing to come to economic sociology of law is to mix general sociology, economic sociology, and sociology of law. Another way now, which is important here, is to include not only like the sociology of the economic sphere and the sociology of the legal sphere and everything which happens inside, so of a sphere of reality, but to include as a subject matter the science of this sphere, the science which is rationalizing what is done in this sphere. And this is in a way what economics does for the economic sphere and what law does for the legal sphere, especially since there have been theories which claim that there's an autonomous rationality inspiring that sphere, explaining like the logic of action in that sphere. Now, sociologists always think everything is also linked with everything else, and economy is embedded in society, and so is the law, and so on. And now to study how certain sciences, scientific disciplines, humanistic disciplines, rationalize social reality in specific spheres, that's then part of sociology of science, sociology of economics, sociology of jurisprudence, and so on. And this is what I'm trying to highlight here, that what I'm doing is also like a sociology of economics as a discipline, rationalizing certain things, and now I'm interested in these extensions or paradigm shifts within economics, which make it turn into behavioral economics, which also expand to law and economics, and then ultimately behavioral law and economics. Okay, so all this kind of exists. Now, my own background, so I'm sociologist, economic sociologist. I'm also, which is now my department at the Vienna University of Economics and Business, I'm also a socio-economist. So socio-economists are those who do economics from a more integrated social, scientific, and interdisciplinary and pluralist perspective. So that's our label there. Now, what I'm interested in is then not only how socioeconomics and neoclassical economics relate to each other, nor what's the main part of the ongoing debate, how behavioral economics and neoclassical economics relate to each other, but how socioeconomics and behavioral economics relate to each other, given that both are not so insisting on this autonomous rationality of the economic sphere, but kind of bring social issues in, psychological issues in, and so on. So in a way, behavioral economics, and this is what I commented on briefly before, is part of an unfriendly takeover, like doing things in a more sociological way. So doing economics in a more sociological, more psychological, and so on way. And so sociologists have to pay attention, have to see what they can subscribe to, and where they see maybe also constitutive differences. And this is part of the motivation here. So now, just to illustrate that, and this is already entering into these different views of the social, neoclassical economics is basically quite abstract and formalistic. So it suggests abstract agents, starts from economic axioms, and the models are in a way also ahistorical. Now, compared to that, behavioral economics brings forward a new realism, and this is also a term which can be applied to law, starts explicitly from concrete flesh and blood individuals. So not abstract agents, but indeed like people like you and me, and individuals, not necessarily collective entities. Instead of these economic axioms, there are empirical behavioral regularities, and instead of this ahistorical approach, a big part of, I would say, behavior and neuroeconomics really goes towards evolutionary explanations, stretching very long back in time. Now, if I, in an ideal, typical way, want to distinguish socioeconomics from that, then there's definitely more constructivism in it. There's a stronger emphasis on entities or dynamics or structures beyond individuals, so which I here used for the placeholder in social institutions, instead of behavioral laws or even regularities. We would emphasize social contingency, so that things depend also on the time and place where you are, and instead of like these long time evolutionary perspectives, we focus more on culture, and so less on nature, more on culture, even if the distinction is not clear. So we have these co-evolution of nature and culture, genes and culture as well. Okay, and the second approach, which is also just to show you where I am and how I have to relate different kinds of discourses. So this is now bringing the law in. So there has been now for longer a discourse, a discipline called law and economics, which is inspired by neoclassical economics. That's like the starting point. There has been for longer an intersection of law and behavioral sciences, which is also linked with 20th century legal realism, that you did introduce social scientific methods into legal studies. But there has been like a shift from having like sociology as a lead science to being more psychological and orientation, which is now visible in the present peak of behavioral science and law, which is behavioral law and economics. And then there's law and neuroscience, and this relates to what Professor Geppert referred to with regard to the question of free will and criminal responsibility, which has been discussed at length in the last decade or so, which is the strongest kind of discourse inside law and neuroscience. So there's not so much law and neuroeconomics yet, but what I'm interested in, and this is what I'm trying to hint at here, is exactly the intersection of these discourses. So on the one hand, here we have law and behavior economics, there we have law and neuroeconomics, and I'm kind of interested in what role this intersection, this point of origin or convergence, as I say, plays in this overall kind of development of the debate. And one suspicion, and this has indeed to do also with this neurolaw or law and neuroscience discourse, is that there's a hidden utilitarianism even there where there's no explicit economics inside. So this is kind of like a promise which I cannot really fulfill yet, that there is somehow something to be found in these recent developments, which is inspired very much by broadening the societal role of utilitarian discourse, but including like new behavioral arguments. Okay, so this much on what approach am I taking here after all. Now on the social ontology of behavior and neuroeconomics, so what I have to do, if I don't want to scratch at the surface only, is that I really have to understand what's going on in the field as a whole, and so I have to expose myself a little bit really to stuff discussed there, and that's not that easy because it's getting very tricky very soon. So what I tried to do in the recent, well, it's been more than the last half year that I tried doing that, is to structure the field and understand, like from a bird's eye point of view, what's going on there. So most people are not doing that. Most people work in a specific corner of the field and don't question that. But I want to understand the field as a whole, and then if I want to criticize it, then I have to do justice enough to it so that I know what part of it I'm now talking about, and not just. So for my purposes, the following structure seems to be useful in order also to understand different concepts of the social in the field. So this is that mainstream behavioral economics is characterized by mainly a cognitive strand and a social strand, next to like neoclassically oriented theoretical boundary work. And there's also like an alternative strand of behavioral economics which works more with the concept of ecological rationality, which I am not going to focus here now, but which is also very interesting because it opens up kind of to the social context in a broader way. Happily, mainstream neuroeconomics has similar strands, so neoclassical neuroeconomics is independent from this behavioral trend, really wants to prove that we have a physiological utility function in our brains, so that our brains are efficient machines, like maximizing not only our happiness but also our fitness, so in evolutionary terms again. But then there are these extensions of behavioral economics into neuroeconomics, really in this cognitive strand and the social strand as before, and we also have like first hints of, or like hints which have to be excavated from literature 10 years old, like to an alternative strand of neuroeconomics, which is more institutional in orientation. So now this is the heaviest part, but I'm not going to expect from you now that you immediately go through everything. But again, from this bird's eye point of view, if we want to locate what behavioral economics is doing, what neoclassical economics is doing as a theory of action, as an explanation of human behavior, then we have to locate it in the field of theories which the social sciences have at large. And this is what I tried doing here, so that I try to start from this dualism of structure and agency, which many of you will be familiar with, and then try to narrow down where these guys are really working on. So here you recognize Max Weber's four ideal types of action. So those theories which focus in instrumental rationality, they are kind of like the starting point for a fully fledged rational choice approach. And then you can go the further step that some people then insist that utility maximization is the basic principle of everything, and then you have refinements of that, like having additional assumptions like the self-interest and exogenous given stable preferences, and perfect knowledge, correct beliefs about the world, consistent choice, fully consistent choice, as I argued before. And then down here you are at the fully fledged rational economic man model. Now the two components or two strands of behavioral economics which I want to talk about or focus on are these two cognitive component and social component, which deviate from the standard economic approach or rational choice approach by loosening these assumptions. So here we do not claim full consistency and correctness of our beliefs anymore, but we consider like situational context effects on our action, which might actually make us less consistent than in that moment, but can be explained by that. And here we give up this strong or narrow assumption of self-interest and allow for other regarding preferences, and which is as important, do not claim that preferences are stable and given, but think about how they form the formation of preferences over time in individual lives, but also in the history of society and even in human evolution. Okay, so on the cognitive strand, and now this you can read with me. So the cognitive strand focuses on individual judgment and decision making, one person at a time. It takes issue with this substantive specification of the rationality principle in terms of correct beliefs about the world and consistent choice between available alternatives. That's what we started from, this apple and oranges thing. And these assumptions are modified to account for cognitive illusions, biases, and context effects, situational effects, framing effects, and so on, which lead us to make judgment errors and change our preferences in an ad hoc manner. The social strand of behavioral economics focuses on small group settings of strategic interaction, so at least two persons. It distances itself from this strong assumption of self-interest, which is not a must in rational choice, but often included in a fully fledged model in empirical applications, and instead includes social or interdependent preferences, so that I also enjoy the benefits which others get, and allows for preference change and formation over time. Okay, so what I found in now these specifications of behavioral economics is that they do include social factors, but still in a limited way. And I use the term like bounded sociality. So they talk about boundedness all of the time, and their own understanding of social life sociality is also bounded. And this is exactly where I make this argument of a still naturalist and individualist research orientation, which does not account so much for the interaction of brains, behaviors, and institutions. So institutions is my favorite term there. And this I want to illustrate briefly in this quite advanced graph of those of you who know Coleman's boat, and as an illustration of methodological individualism, will recognize this kind of up here. And this, so this is about like that a social situation has effects on an individual, the individual acts, and then individual actions aggregated over many individuals to create a social outcome, a social phenomenon. Or so now this is simply extended by having the neural level. So I go down to the brain. I don't leave it at this individual behavioral level, but I go down into what happens in the brain. And now the point, the criticism which I want to make about most of behavioral and neuroeconomics is that while in theory the model would look like this, with arrows pointing down and arrows pointing up, much what you find is emphasizing like what is called upward causation. So that in a way, when you point to what's going on in the brain, you think now your explanation is sufficient, without then going back to how does that enter into the brain, or how has the brain been shaped in that way, or I mean, I guess you get the point, no? So upward causation is emphasized over downward causation. And the second thing, so this is about different levels of analysis, so that this like really the effects from the institutional level to the behavioral, to the brain level, they have to be emphasized as well, or they have to be studied as well. And the other argument is the timescales argument, so that behavioral and neuroeconomics often does want to argue in a dynamic way, so things can change over time, things develop over time. We do not just pick them from the blue sky, but there is kind of an origin of preferences and things. But the emphasis is on the largest timescale possible, like which is millions of years back in time. This is when we human beings kind of started to branch off from other primates, so other great apes. So this is strongly emphasized, and then also this period here is strongly emphasized, which is like up to 10,000 years ago. So which is what I think, or what I discussed with my colleague, is not really the period which social sciences have in mind when they talk about institutions, because this institutional development and this kind of explosion of institutions, that cannot date it before human beings settled, before like the agricultural evolution. So this is kind of, but it's also like trying to think it through. And now what I'm trying to find in these different studies is, when they talk about human evolution, what period are they focusing on? Are they focusing on the last 10,000 years, on the last 100,000s of years, or the last millions of years? And I think it makes a huge difference, and makes a huge difference in policy implications. And now, like as a side note, because I have to make sure that I get everything across. As an economic sociologist, I study market society, market economy, and its interaction with society. The time scale which we are usually looking at is 200 years, 500 years. So 500 years is like going back to Columbus or so. Looking at the law, I understood, okay, I have to figure in the Western legal tradition. So this is then maybe 2,000 years. It's still minuscule compared to the timescales which our colleagues from behavioral and neuroscience are looking at. Okay. So normative implications of the cognitive strand. I'm going back to nudging now. So nudging, and I'll just sum it up now, so we can discuss it later if you like. So nudging is a socio-technical kind of intervention into public policy issues, and it works in a certain way, which is that it identifies a social problem. For example, if people do not have enough savings for their old age, for retirement, then they think, okay, this is a problem of irrational decision making over lifetime. So people have not started saving early enough, or so they were a bit boundedly rational in the best way. So how can I cure that? That's the idea. What I have to do. So I have to compensate for this bounded rationality somehow. And this is the work of choice architecture. The illustration you saw in the Homer cartoon at the beginning. So I have to do little tricks so that people would act in their own best interest, even if they have not really in mind to start saving for their retirement yet. And this is, many of you will have heard about that you change the default option from having to consciously decide I want to enroll in a savings plan to I'm automatically enrolled and have to consciously step out if I want. So that's very prominent nowadays, and you have seen that also in many marketing things already, that you have to opt out and not opt in. Normative implications of the social strand. This is now a little bit trickier, and this is exactly what I try to find out first. So the social strand, because it is about interacting individuals, and it is about social preferences, allowing for that we cherish what the others get and so on. It looks intrinsically more sociological. And now, can I blame them with the same accusations? which I made on this cognitive strand and especially the nudging. And one has to be much more cautious then. So one has to really look at how they argue and how they conceive of social preferences. If they're not considered as given anymore, so this is kind of the default. You could now say everybody has social preferences, that we would be cooperative by nature, for example. But if I now argue that they are that they develop over time, they are endogenous, then I go really beyond also what I still have in the nudging. So in the nudging, I also still have this, that I try to influence your decision making in the moment it happens. So for example, if I want you to choose a certain option rather than another and give a prompt, most other customers preferred this option, then I kind of suggest that you can run with a crowd or so. So that would be a social nudge. This would be this in the moment of decision making, and when I don't have this nudge, it might not happen anymore. But what implications are there when preferences are really considered as endogenous over lifetime, over civilizational development, over the evolution of humankind? And here the policy implications are different, but we again have like a kind of may I say conservative effect. So if I claim humans are like that or have been like that for reasons of their evolutionary history, then it's almost as fixed as just attaching it to human nature as such. So it means also I cannot easily influence that, change that, but I have to exploit that rather in my policies. While in contrast, if I argue that preference can develop over time, and this is, for example, done in development policy based on behavioral economics in the realm of the World Bank, then I try re-education programs. So then I try to teach the poor people in the world who are also not acting rationally enough to relearn. For example, and this is something to have fewer children, so that they get soap operas to watch and then aspire to be this middle-class person who does not have to have 5 kids or so. So this is the traditional way, which we know already, like educating people or indoctrinating them as you wish. Now, I have to calculate my. Okay, so I have one other example which might raise some discussion about this, how the market economy is approached and perhaps rationalized in behavioral and neuroeconomics, and this is based on some experiment which you might also be familiar with. The first one which I have here, which is endowment effect experiments, and this is relevant to the law and discussed in the law as well, because it relates kind of to ownership property regimes in its implications. So let me briefly turn to that. Okay, so endowment effect is like if I offer you, or if I give you now like some item, famous is a ceramic coffee mug, and say, okay, this is now yours, you own it, and then offer in the next step to exchange that coffee mug for like a nice pencil about same economic value, then the likelihood that you will exchange for that other good is lower than the one would expect if like the preference for one item over the other would just be randomized or so. So most people will stick to the mug. So why? So because they have been endowed with that. So this is what the term here just describes, endowment effect. So people stick to that, and it's irrational because it means like in a way you are willing to pay less for an item when you do not own it yet than you want to accept when you own it. So if I had offered you to buy the mug, you would have maybe said €5. But if I now ask you how much money do you want for me to rebuy the mug from you, then you say $7.50 or so. And this is kind of the ownership effect or this endowment effect. Okay, and this is economically speaking irrational, especially when you think about financial markets and holding shares or or nice papers or so, then it has to do with this, what the behavioral economists call loss aversion, so that you hang on too long to things just because you have them. Yeah? So it's not unimportant as a phenomenon. It has been interpreted in all these ways. But now, how is it being studied, and what can we say about like the regularity, the properties, the law-like properties of this endowment effect? So is this just a behavioral law, or is it not? And I find it not so easy to find that out, or really get a final opinion on that. And you come across like studies which are part of evolutionary anthropology, which is again like going back hundreds of thousands to millions of years, or you do it in a cross-cultural or even intra-cultural way, that you try to see if you can make the ownership, this endowment effect, stronger or weaker, depending on kind of role descriptions or so, depending on the situation, how you design it, how the experiment is designed. Now, just to illustrate that, so this argument which goes back to, yeah, it must be really in our history as primates and in our evolutionary history, they then go back to capuchin monkeys, which spread off from the line which became us like 35 million years ago. So and they train them so that they can, well, understand this experiment, so that they have something, but then offered in return they can hand out that and get the other thing. So they learn to trade. And yes, it shows capuchin monkeys do have an endowment effect. Now, another example was to try to find tribes, contemporary tribes, which look still a lot like we think we lived 10,000 of years ago. Here the Hasda people in Tanzania, I think, and did endowment effect experiments with them. And what they found here, just as an illustration, is that depending on where they live and how exposed they are to tourists, like this is kind of a spot where tourists come, a market spot, and these red dots are camps nearby, while these yellow diamonds are camps far away. And so the argument is that here's high exposure to like market people and market transaction, while in these distant camps there's low exposure. And now, what do you think what they found? So which of these has a higher or lower endowment effect? So in a way, the argument would be that those more in this natural state of ours would definitely have it, but here they don't. So here the far away people have less of an endowment effect than those who have been exposed to market exchange, maybe to property conception, to that one owns things and so on. So just having like these two examples, and you can do that also with other great apes and other people and so on, gives you mixed results. So, which does not stop people from jumping to conclusions, and this is exactly where one has to look closely again. So what can one, because people love to theorize on like this naturalism of the endowment effect. So there are lots of papers written on that, just from the armchair, of course. Okay, so this is just this example, and I will finish off with just a hint at the broader project here. And what I have presented so far mostly was like this critical analysis, which I also do from the armchair, that I look at all these different papers and try to understand what concepts of the social they have and how they differ from each other, and then look into what implications they draw from that, or what I think is inherent in these concepts. So this is like studying knowledge production, like from this bird's eye point of view. What I also want to do, going beyond my work here at the center, is to be less critical, be a bit more constructive, and go into really these economic experiments and try to reconstruct them, maybe restage them, and try to find out like if one can change the results, the outcomes, and then the conclusions drawn from that by changing a little bit well, for example, the instructions given to the experimental subjects and so on. And this would then also help to find out about if these effects are constructed or not. So I can talk more about that. And finally, the overall project is about like trying to bring more like institutional perspectives in, like this, taking this institutional layer seriously. And from a sociological point of view, this can well be done in the framework of distributed cognition, which is based on the idea that not all happens in our heads, and decisions are not just made in the heads, but that it's always an interaction on my personal cognitive capacities and all these, all this architecture, I can say, or all these institutions around me. And think about, and this is now the picture I will close with, think about us working with computers. So we interact with computers in a way that cognition is the sum of what we do together in a way. And this illustrates that you cannot just make these brain scans and then know everything about our decision making. But I think it's still quite underestimated in how the research practice looks like. Thanks a lot.